Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk about what's happening in the economy in France, because France is another country that's in a state of complete chaos at the moment. And the reason why there's a crisis going on right now is because the Prime Minister recently called a vote to basically get everybody to support him. But unfortunately, he lost that vote. Rather than being a confidence vote, it became a vote of no confidence, and he's now had to leave his position. And you might be thinking, who is the Prime Minister of France? Isn't it that guy Emmanuel Macron? Well, no, because he's actually the president. France has an interesting two-tier structure whereby it has a president and a prime minister. And this was actually introduced in 1958. So when they have the vote, the president is elected and then the president selects the prime minister. So that's basically how it works. And the president predominantly looks after international affairs, commands the armed forces, and appoints the prime minister, and he can dissolve the National Assembly. And the prime minister, who's appointed by the president, is basically running all of domestic affairs, so the economy, social policy, day-to-day administration. And he's in charge of putting together the budget. And this was the problem for the existing or previous prime minister, as he is now, because he wanted to introduce austerity measures, because France has been overspending like crazy. France is like one of your friends who just can't help themselves. They're constantly spending, despite the fact that they haven't got enough income to cover all of the costs. And if you don't have enough income to cover your spending, you have to borrow, you have to take on debt. And that's exactly what France has been doing. Just before we move on any further today, I'd like to ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button. It doesn't cost you anything. It only takes 1 second of your day, but it really helps me with the algorithm and helps to put a smile on my face. So thank you for doing that. Let's move on. And you can see from this table that Emmanuel Macron has actually had 5 different prime ministers during the period that he's been president. He was first elected in 2017. He's into his second term now. You can only actually serve 2 terms as president, same as the USA. And so he will be leaving at the end of this term. But you can see the level of turmoil that France has been facing. And if you look over the past few years, we've actually had 3 prime ministers since 2024, and there's going to be a 4th one that will be appointed shortly. Now, the question is, what's going on? Why is France spending so much money? Well, one of the reasons is because it's a socialist country and it has a very generous welfare state. So it has huge outlays on pensions, and the pension age in France was only recently raised from 62 to 64, which is still at the lower end for developed countries. And it's spending 14% of its GDP on pensions, which is the highest in the European Union and some of the highest in the world, in fact. It also has really good healthcare, so universal coverage, state reimbursements, hospital funding. Lots of money goes into that pot. And it also has a huge bill for unemployment benefits and social aid. So that's one of the areas where it's spending a lot of money. The other area predominantly is the public sector, so people who are employed directly by the state. So France has a very large civil service, 5.6 million state employees, and public sector pay and benefits consume a big chunk of the budget. It's got a decentralized system, national, regional, departmental, municipal governments who all run their own bureaucracies. So that's a big drain on public finances. It's also spending a lot on education, so huge spending on schools, universities, and student benefits. It gives generous subsidies for housing, families, and energy. And it also heavily subsidizes key industries such as nuclear, railways, agriculture, and green energy. In terms of its defence spending, well, it's meeting its requirement of 2% for GDP, which is around about 60 billion euros annually. So that's somewhere in the region of 66, 67 billion dollars. But as we've talked about in previous videos, Donald Trump wants NATO countries to actually increase their spending to 5%. And obviously, that would more than double the commitment from France's perspective. So that would put even further strain onto the budget. And then one of the other rising problems in France, as with a lot of countries that have huge amounts of debt, is that the debt servicing costs are increasing rapidly. So we'll go on to talk about France's debt in a moment. but currently they're paying somewhere in the region of 60 billion, 65 billion euros per year in interest, but that's forecast to increase to more than 100 billion by 2029, partly because the debt's going up and partly because the cost of the debt is going up. Now, government spending in itself isn't a bad thing if you can afford it. However, the key metric is looking at government spending against your GDP, so basically your outlays against your income. And as you can see from this table, France is actually right at the top of this list for the G20, so the biggest 20 economies in the world. France's percentage of government spending against its GDP is over 57%, and you can see from the previous period it's actually increasing. The next highest in the G20 is Italy with just over 50%. The euro area on average is just under 50. So we've got Germany, Spain, Netherlands all coming in here. The United Kingdom, which is no longer part of the eurozone, is at 44.4. The USA, 39.7. And then we've got Japan at 39, South Korea 37, Switzerland 32, Australia 26.5, and India less than 15%. But the point really of showing you this is just to show what the high level of government spending against France's income is. And that's obviously a problem because it's difficult to cut back on that. That's what the Prime Minister was trying to do in his austerity budget. He wanted to cut spending by 44 billion euros per year, but all of the other politicians in France have voted against that, so he's now had to abandon that and he's lost his job. And if we look at how France compares to the rest of the world, there is only one country globally that's spending more of its GDP on government spending, and that's Finland, which is at 57.7%, so only slightly higher than France. The way things are going, France will probably overtake Finland at some point in the near future. Now, in terms of looking at the proposed austerity budget, one of the main reasons why the previous Prime Minister needed to cut the budget is because of the exploding public debt. So the amount of debt is increasing. It's currently sitting at over 100%. It's 114% of gross domestic product. It's around about 3.35 trillion euros. And those borrowing costs are rising rapidly. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that bond costs all around the world have been going up in terms of the yield. So we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. And as I mentioned earlier, if the Prime Minister didn't take any action, then the borrowing costs of the debt was going to be more than 100 billion by 2029. Now, one of the other reasons why France needed to cut its spending is because it's part of the European Union. In fact, it's one of the senior members. France and Germany are the two biggest countries in the European Union, so they really need to be leading by example. But as we'll see in a moment, they're certainly not leading by example. Well, they are leading, but in the wrong direction. They're actually breaching the rules by the most out of all of the countries, because the EU has rules around the percentage of GDP that you can lose, so your budget deficit, and also how much debt you're allowed to have. And all of this is leading to a loss of confidence in France in the international markets. So rating agencies are potentially downgrading France. And that's why the Prime Minister put together his 44 billion in cuts. And he was looking to do things like scrap public holidays to boost the number of working days, so basically make people go to work more in France, freezing welfare spending, so cutting back on how much you could get from the state, and reducing state subsidies to some of the big industries. But obviously that hasn't been approved, so that's all by the by now. Now, if we look at what's been going on with debt in France, this chart shows the situation for the last 25 years, dating back to 2020. And what we can see here is that debt has been increasing in every single year virtually, and it's now up to this 3.35 trillion level. So that wouldn't be a problem if France was growing equally rapidly. But if we have a look at what's been happening with GDP, you can see that it is nowhere near the same sort of shape as the graph we just looked at. In fact, it's growing at a very slow rate of around about 1.2% per year, whereas the debt is going up rapidly. So in terms of the ratio between GDP and debt, it's now over 100% and it's likely to carry on rising. Now, the EU fiscal rules, which have been put into place to try to make sure all of the member states look after their economies and don't get into financial difficulty, they state that the annual budget deficit, so if you're spending more than you're earning, it should not be more than 3% of GDP. So that's the maximum deficit that you're allowed. And in terms of public debt, then it should be below 60% of GDP. And if it's above, then it needs to come down rapidly, around 1/20th per year if you're over the 60%. Now, these rules were relaxed during the COVID period, but they've been reinstated in 2024. So all member states, including France, need to get in line with the programme. And this chart shows the level of state spending in the European Union by country. And what we've got here is a colour coding whereby the percentage against GDP, so how much you're spending of your GDP on state spending, goes from pink of less than 30 to dark red to above 55%. And you can see that France is the biggest offender. It's actually spending the most. We just saw the details earlier, but it's spending more than all of the other countries as a percentage. And that's clearly a problem for what's meant to be one of the main parties in the European Union. And if we have a look at the actual details, you can see that in terms of public debt, France comes in at number 3 on the offenders list. It's actually the third worst at 114% of GDP. There are only 2 countries that have a higher percentage, Italy at 138% and Greece at 161%. And the Greek economy is obviously not in a very good state. But when you look at the rest of the countries here, most of the big countries are actually well over this 60% limit. Spain's at 106, Portugal 99, the EU average is 83, and Germany's sitting at 64, although Germany is working its way back to that 60% rule. On this chart, the only 2 countries that are actually compliant are the Netherlands and Ireland, where they've got 51% and 44%. Now, if we have a look at the budget deficit as a comparison to GDP, and the rule here is that you can't have more than 3%, so we've got that line down the middle of the chart. You can see that there are 3 countries that have larger deficits than that 3%. Spain at 3.5%, Italy 4.5%, and France is leading the way with a massive deficit of 5.8%, so almost double what the EU allows. You can see that Portugal, Germany, Greece, Netherlands and Ireland are all well within that 3% limit. However, they're all still running a deficit against their budget, so they're all spending more than they're earning. Now, in terms of what's going on with the bond cost, the cost of the debt in France, this chart shows the movement in the yield on 30-year bonds in France over the past 10 years. And you can see that 10 years ago, France was paying around about 2% on average for its bonds. However, between 2015 and 2022, that yield fell to less than 1%. And actually, it was closer to zero than it was to 1%. So France has had a long period where it's been able to issue debt at a very low cost, similar to a lot of other countries. And the problem with that is that it's taken on lots and lots of debt at that low cost. But even though the coupon is relatively low on those older bonds, it's still seeing a huge increase in the cost of its debt. Now, if we look at what's happened since 2022, the bond yields have risen rapidly from less than 1% to more than 4.3%. So that's an increase of 4, possibly even 5 times against some of these old historic rates. And as we've talked about in other videos, as the bonds come up for maturity and have to be refinanced, France will see a huge increase in its actual cost of the debt because it will be taking out bonds that maybe have a coupon of 1% and replacing them with a new bond that has a coupon of 4.3%. So that's going to cause a massive increase. And if we look at what's been going on with the 10-year bond yield, this is similar to what we looked at recently in other countries. France has had a long period of time where it was able to issue bonds between 2015 and 2022 at less than 1%. And in fact, during the COVID pandemic, it was actually issuing bonds with no coupon. Look, it's gone below the zero line. So effectively, you're not getting any yield on that. Now, they're only really bought by the central banks in countries, really just to provide some form of financing. But you can see that over the past 3 years, the yield has risen rapidly and is now sitting around 3.5%. And what that means is that all of those bonds that were issued between 2015 and 2022, when they come up for renewal, France is going to see probably a tripling or possibly even a quadrupling of the interest costs for all of that debt. And that's going to add further to the burden. That's one of the reasons why they're expecting the bond costs to go up above 100 billion euros per year. Now, the problem that Emmanuel Macron is currently facing is that he has a minority position in the government. This chart shows you the actual voting situation in France. So we've got different coloured circles here representing the different parties. Now, Emmanuel Macron is sitting in the middle in this yellow sort of brown section, Renew and Allies. And between them, they have 161 seats. But the problem that they have is that to have a majority, you need 289. So they're not even close to getting a majority. They're over 100 seats away. So that means that when you put anything up for a vote, anything to get approved by the government, the opposition needs a vote in favour of your proposal. And because they're the opposition, they don't tend to want to do that. So if you look at the opposition blocs, the left, the New Popular Front, NFP, has 192 seats. So basically, they've got more than Emmanuel Macron has under his power. Now, we've got National Rally and Allies, 138. So they can team up with Macron's parties, but if they decide that they don't like the proposal, such as the austerity budget put forward by the previous Prime Minister, then they decide not to vote for it and it can't get approved. And this voting system is a major problem because it means that everything just goes through the mill and nothing gets signed off on. So it's very difficult for the French government to actually get things agreed, approved, and signed off. And so what we're seeing is this constant pattern of prime ministers coming in, failing to get support, failing to get approval for what they've put forward, and then leaving. And I think what this means is that we won't really see a change to this system until there's another general election in France, and maybe we'll see a new president and a new prime minister at some point in the near future. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in France right now is really quite interesting, but also we're seeing it in lots of other countries around the world because many countries took on huge amounts of debt during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that debt is now becoming more and more expensive because during the pandemic period, interest rates were at virtually zero. So it was a great time to borrow because you didn't really have to pay much in the way of coupons or interest. However, over the past few years, we have seen bond yields increasing rapidly, partly as a fact that people are no longer interested in investing into bonds. There are better options elsewhere. So we've seen the price of bonds going down, which pushes up the yields. So France is suffering from the same situation as lots of other countries. But I think what's unique to France is that because it's a socialist country and it has a very good welfare system, it has good pension system, it has beneficial working practices, lots of public holidays, relatively short working weeks, then all of that's good if you're a citizen of France, but not so good if you're trying to manage the economy, because what France is experiencing now is that its spending is significantly higher compared to its GDP than every other country in the world apart from Finland. But the problem that France has on top of what Finland is doing is that it has a huge amount of debt. Finland doesn't. So Finland doesn't have to worry about spending 100 billion euros per year on interest costs. So France is now finding itself in a very difficult situation whereby it's spending a lot more than it's earning, its debt is continuing to rise, it is significantly beyond the recommended limits put in place by the European Union in terms of both total amount of debt and public spending, and that's going to be very difficult to fix. And France is one of the leading lights in the European Union. It should be leading the way and actually setting the example to other countries rather than being the biggest offender. So what we've seen over the past few years is that Emmanuel Macron, who's the president of France, has appointed prime ministers, and those prime ministers have tried to address the problem. And the way to address that problem is to reduce public spending. If you're spending more than half of all of your GDP on public spending, if you can cut back on it, then clearly you'll reduce the amount of debt that you need to borrow and reduce those interest costs. But the problem that Emmanuel Macron and the prime ministers have had is that they don't have a majority in parliament. They've actually got a minority position. So they are reliant on opposition parties agreeing with them and then voting in favour of whatever it is they're proposing. And as we talked about earlier in this video, the most recent Prime Minister proposed an austerity budget. He wanted to cut spending by €44 billion per year. Everybody else said, we don't really fancy that. We're not voting for it. He had a confidence vote where he said to everybody, back me or sack me. And they all said, that's fine, we're happy to sack you. You can go, bring on the next guy. So France is now onto this conveyor belt system where a new prime minister will come in. He's going to have to propose a similar sort of idea because he's got to cut spending somehow. And it's likely that all the other politicians will just turn around and say, we don't really fancy that either. Next, let's bring on another prime minister. So I think France basically has got itself into a very sticky situation. It's painted itself into a corner the way the voters have set up parliament. And until the parliamentary setup changes and we see a different shake-up, I don't think France is going to be able to resolve the problem. Therefore, it won't be able to cut back on its spending. Its debt will increase. Its debt costs are going to increase even further. That's going to put more pressure onto the public budget, and this becomes a really vicious circle. So the overall summary of today's video is that France is currently in a dire situation from a financial point of view. It is getting worse, and the government is unable to change the situation. And until there's a new general election in France, I don't think we will see a resolution, and things are going to deteriorate further. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button. Really appreciate that. And thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me going. And here's something to put a smile on your face.